Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another True Tales of Terror with Dretwog. Today's tale, The Tunnel, is the fourth in the True Tales of Terror series. This tunnel has a tragic past and its own separate dark history from the tale you are about to hear. The tunnel itself was quite the undertaking for the time period it was built. Completed in 1875, although the tunnel is marked on its laid stone 1877. Roughly 150 years ago, it claimed the lives of 200 souls during its construction. Fires, explosions, and freak accidents plagued its build, and giving it the title, The Bloody Pit. A single set of tracks, and spanned just under 5 miles at 4.7 or 7.5 kilometers officially, and cut straight through the rolling hills of the Northeast. In its center, central shaft, a 1,028 foot or 300 meter deep ventilation shaft needed to allow the long tunnel to breathe. At its top, an innocuous steel building covering the massive borehole lined with stone. Two friends decided to go for an adventure one weekend and had decided on a destination they were both really excited to go to. The tunnel. The Bloody Pit. Of course, growing up in the area, they had heard all of the strange tales about its history. The verified truth about the tunnel was grim on its own, but the two boys had heard stories that were more modern. Tales of people hearing whispers and voices, people screaming, and even full-on apparitions were all included. Tom pulled up at his friend's house and beeped the horn. Dan looked out the window, seeing his best friend's Jeep parked in the road. Grabbing his backpack, he looked inside, making a mental checklist of what he thought they may need. Flashlights and some extra batteries, a headlamp and some water. He put a couple of granola bars in the front pouch. It's not that long, he thought to himself, and figured it was enough, shouldering the pack and heading out the door. Dan locked the door and headed out to the street where the Jeep was waiting. "All right," Dan said, clicking in his seatbelt and making it snap loudly. "I've got a bunch of flashlights and batteries," Dan started to say. "Me too," Tom replied, eyeing his bag on the back seat through the rear view. "Which side should we start on?" Dan asked. "Right here," Tom said, turning the Jeep off the country road and onto the dirt access road that led to the tunnel's entrance. They parked the Jeep and made sure it was well off the tracks and moderately hidden from view, tucked into the thick brush that grew along the sides of the tracks and trail. Grabbing and shouldering their packs, Tom locked the Jeep and both friends set off, following the tracks further into the woods. The trail was large and twisted slightly left as they walked. Talking about its dark past, Tom remarked, "I heard it was 200 dead." Dan shook his head. "Nah, bro. I looked it up. It's just under 150. "Confirmed," Tom started. "It's just under 150 confirmed deaths. There's lots of people saying the number was closer to 200. It was a long time ago," he added. "And nobody knows what nobody knows." Just as they finished debating the tunnel's death count, it appeared there before them. 1877 stamped onto a large stone centered above. There was still 20 yards or so before they would be at its entrance, and already the smell of diesel fuel exhaust was getting heavier. The two friends fell silent as they made their approach to its large opening. A small river had formed on the right side of this end of the tunnel. The dampness of the northeast flooded out, filthy and blackened from the constant trains that still actively use this very tunnel to this very day. The smell of diesel was starting to choke Dan, and Tom reached into his back pocket, handing Dan an N95. The two friends both put on the N95s, headlamps, and both carried a large mag light. They moved past its opening and stayed in the middle on the tracks, one after another. Baseball and golf ball sized rocks lined the entire stretch of the tunnel, and large puddles of contaminated water would pool up on both sides. The sound of water dripping was constant, and there's a constant low wind blowing through. As the two friends pushed forward, the large tunnel entrance grew smaller, and the light quickly faded into darkness. Tom turned on his headlamp, turning back to see Dan walking backwards, looking at the entrance. "What's up?" Tom asked. "What if a train comes?" Dan asked, concerned. Tom laughed. "It's not really what so much as a when." "Not funny," Dan snapped back. "Just keep up and you'll be fine," Tom said, and slightly picked up the pace. "Let's go," he added, turning to Dan. "Besides, if a train does come through, we will hear it well before it does. Just stick close to the wall and you'll be fine." Dan did his best to keep up with Tom, but being slightly shorter, he had to work harder to keep up. "You okay?" Tom asked, hearing Dan breathing heavily. "It's just the mask. It's making it harder," Dan replied. Tom slowed his pace to a walk and was about to ask Dan if he needed a break when he thought he heard voices off in the distance, further inside the tunnel. He stopped walking and listened. Dan nearly walked into Tom, not expecting the sudden stop. "What?" Dan started. "Shh!" Tom quickly let out, returning to listening intently. The two friends stood there listening, water constantly dripping, and the wind made a low sound as it made its way through the tunnel. "You hear it?" Tom asked his friend. Dan tried to hear, but the wind and dripping water was all he could. The tunnel entrance long since had disappeared from sight, and Tom knew they must be approaching Central Shaft soon. A massive borehole cut through the mountain, the site of terrible disasters. A huge explosion had killed an entire crew. They continued on, moving quickly and staying in the middle, beams from their headlamps sweeping around the tunnel's expanse. Dan's hair stood on end, and he kept thinking he could hear voices too, behind the wind. Tom stopped again, motioning to his lips with a single raised finger. Dan stopped, acknowledging Tom, nodding. They listened as water dripped, and the wind carried every echo and distorted it. "What was that?" Tom asked. "I don't know," Dan started. "I swear I can hear something." "I know," Tom cut him off. "I just can't quite make it out." And the two set off once again. Dan turned around, having the sense of something, but there was nothing there, just the empty tunnel they traversed. Suddenly, Tom stopped, and Dan almost knocked right into his friend, stopping short. Tom stood there motionless, headlamp pointed at the left wall of the tunnel. "What the fuck is that?" Tom asked aloud. "What?" Dan replied, moving from behind his friend's larger frame, expecting to see something frightening. His headlamp's beams soon joined Tom's and pointed at a small set of concrete steps with an old rusty metal railing running its length and rising up to a small platform and a heavy metal door. "It's just a door," Dan said, looking at it in relief. It wasn't the Grim Reaper. "You don't understand," Tom said. He continued, "There are no doors in this tunnel." Dan looked at it, looking back and around the tunnel's expanse. "Well, what the hell is that then?" Dan said, confused at Tom's reaction. Dan walked off the tracks and over to the concrete steps, turning to his friend. "You coming?" Tom couldn't explain what he saw before him. He had done this very walk several times, and even knew its history well, its construction, its blueprints. There were no doors, no rooms, no stairs of any kind. The tunnel was never meant for people to walk through, only trains. In fact, it was illegal and extremely dangerous to do so. It's dark and wet and cold. The tunnel vents but poorly, and there's barely enough oxygen to breathe, even without the toxic exhaust fumes that blacken the tunnel like a giant ashtray. It was an active, single-rail tunnel, meaning it only had one set of tracks, and trains regularly still made its expanse. "There are no doors in this tunnel," Tom said as his friend climbed the steps and reached for its rusty handle. It creaked loudly as Dan swung it open and pieces of rust fell off as it moved. "Well, I don't know what this is then, but I'm going in," Dan replied, and Tom couldn't believe Dan had entered. "Dude, let's go," Dan yelled from the strange doorway in the tunnel. Tom reluctantly followed, off the tracks and off to the left side, up a few steps and over to the door. Standing there on the concrete, Tom looked around at the tunnel, down the way they came in and up the other. Dan had already ventured further inside, and standing there, Tom felt a sense of unease flood through his body. "Wait up!" he yelled inside and ran after his friend. The thick metal door closed tightly behind Tom, showing a cloud of dust kicked up from the sudden impact. "Dude," Dan yelled from somewhere inside. "Where are you?" Tom yelled back. Tom looked down the corridor, concrete and old metal. Long metal pipes lined the ceiling above it and led in further, longer than the headlight's light beam. Tom started jogging down the strange hall and found Dan in the room attached to the concrete hall that shouldn't exist. Dan was over on the right side, and Tom's headlamp made wide sweeps as he examined the odd room. "Dude, check out these lockers," Dan said, opening one of the rusty lockers and rooting through its antique contents. "What the fuck is this place?" Tom asked aloud. Dan turned and said, "It must have been some workers' area or something, bro." "Dude, there is no workers' area. It's just a straight tunnel through the mountain," Tom said, mind reeling at the thought of being in a place that didn't actually exist. And yet, there he stood, watching his friend search through the rusty old lockers. After the long concrete hall they had both walked through was a room they stood in, rusty lockers on the right, and more steel pipes overhead. Another door at the opposite end and one on the left, centered on the room's dark wall. Tom walked up to the steel door and pulled its heavy, rusty bulk open, peering inside. Another dark concrete room. This one contained old urinals and broken bathroom stalls. Tom moved into the doorway, Dan noticing the light dimmed as Tom moved through. Dan had searched through all the lockers, finding nothing of value or anything worth taking. It was all so old that the papers had rotted into dust, and the few other items had joined the rubble and dirt, making them unidentifiable. Dan followed behind Tom, and they looked around the dark bathroom. "Damn, bro," Dan started. "It looks like the bathroom from that movie." Tom turned and said, "Saw?" "Yeah, doesn't it?" Dan replied. Pieces of the ceiling crunched under Tom's boots as he pushed further, looking into the empty stalls, some missing doors, some missing entire toilets. Turning and heading back to the door they both had entered in, Tom turned to Dan. "Come on, dude. Let's get the hell out of here." Dan took one last look at the concrete room. More of a bunker than a bathroom. Leaving the bathroom, back into the room with the broken and rusty lockers, both locked onto the single metal door at the back of the cold, dark, and damp concrete room. Dan knew Tom wanted to leave. He had said as much, looking at the door they hadn't opened yet. "Let's at least take a look before we leave," Dan said. Waiting for a reply, but approaching the metal door anyway. "Alright, let's see what's in there," Tom said, walking up to the door with his friend. The door was shut tightly and wouldn't budge. Both friends took turns trying to force it open. Dan kicked it hard and large pieces of rust fell off to the concrete floor below. "It's not gonna open, bro," Tom said, hoping it wouldn't. Dan stepped back and readied himself, leaning hard, and with all of his weight, he blasted the door again. More rust fell off and joined its counterparts on the floor. The last kick had worked, and the door slowly opened, showing another concrete hallway. The two friends stood there, headlamps pointed down the hallway. It seemingly went on as far as they could see. "Holy shit," Dan yelled, seeing the expanse. "I wonder how long it goes," he added. And Tom said back, "And to where?" Piercing down the long hall, pipes fitted above their heads. Before Tom could say anything, Dan started down the strange, dark hallway. Tom followed behind, a deep feeling of dread filling his body. The two friends continued down the shaft, crunching pieces of rusty metal from the long pipes above their heads. The door behind them slowly shrunk out of view as they progressed down the long, cold corridor. Moving forward, Tom turned around and looked up to the hall. The door they had entered through was totally out of sight now, and yet the strange corridor just continued on. Both light beams from the friends' headlamps showed the hall ahead. Both friends had stopped walking. Dan in front squinted his eyes and asked Tom, "Do you see that?" Tom stepped to the side of his friend and looked down the corridor, seeing what looked like a metal door, but with a single glass window centered on its top half. Noticing it seemed illuminated, Tom reached up and clicked off his headlamp, holding his finger on the switch. Dan did the same, and once his headlamp was off, both friends stood there frozen and confused. There, some ways down the long hall, was a door with a window, and it was glowing with a pale yellow light. "What is down there?" Dan said, excited, and started moving again towards the old door and glowing window. Tom was hesitant, and the feeling of fear was rising. He followed his friend. They continued on, moving down the strange concrete hall that shouldn't exist. Yet, here they both were, moving ahead, deeper into the shaft of cold concrete. 5 minutes passed, and neither friend said much as they proceeded down the long hall, the pale light of the window illuminating the shaft just enough to see. Without their bright headlamps, they pushed forward and got no closer. After about 10 minutes, Dan stopped and turned to Tom. "What the fuck? Why is this hall so long?" Dan said. "We should have already reached it," Tom said, turning back on his headlamp. "Come on, it can't be that much further," Tom said, pushing past Dan and taking lead again. He started jogging, and Dan followed closely behind. They both moved down the hall, continuing down, but somehow making no progress at all. No matter how fast or how much ground they covered, the strange door got no closer. Starting to get frustrated, Tom tried to rationalize what was happening. He knew the tunnel proper well, and he had made it through several times. This was different. He never saw any doors or stairs or anything on his multiple trips through. Just being in this strange area was starting to take a toll on his mind, and he reeled in thoughts of what could be happening. Trying to get to the door, both friends ran down the hall, the occasional crunch of rusty metal underfoot as they moved deeper inside. The door they tried to get to stayed static, growing no closer to the two friends. Both headlamps bobbed as they ran towards the strange door at the end of the hall. "This is crazy," Tom said, looking back at Dan. "We should have long since have been there already," Dan replied. "Doesn't make any sense," Tom said quickly, slowing his pace. "What are we even doing?" Tom said, looking down at the corridor, at the door just out of grasp and its odd lit-up window. An audible click was heard by both friends, and the door they tried fruitlessly to reach went dark. "Wait, what?" Dan started saying, and they both watched as the hallway just continued on as far as they could see. Where's the door?" Tom scanned the long hall with his headlamp. It just seemed to go on infinitely. No sign of a door. No sign of an end. "Alright, fuck this, let's go," Tom said, turning to Dan. "Dude, we can't just bail now," Dan answered. "We gotta see what's down there, where this goes." Tom, wanting to leave, begrudgingly agreed, and the two continued down the concrete hall. 10 minutes passed, and seemingly no progress was made. They were no closer, and it just went on and on. Finally, Tom had had enough and stopped, turning to Dan once again. "Fuck this," Tom said. "We need to turn around," he added. Dan looked down the corridor and wanted to see where it went. Even Dan, driven by curiosity, was feeling the strangeness of this place. How they had continued deeper and further and somehow had made no progress. The door and that light, he thought to himself. Almost reading his friend's mind, Tom looked at his friend. "I know. I saw it too. But something just isn't right," Tom said, adding, "We need to get the fuck out of here now." Dan agreed, and both friends turned around. Pointing their bright headlamps back the way they had came, they started up the corridor, walking at first, and soon a sprint. Shortly thereafter, they were both running quickly, their steps echoing loudly as they moved on. 10 minutes passed, and they continued on. A faint yellow glow creeped in from behind, and Dan turned, seeing the door and glass window again behind them, just out of reach. Tom didn't look back. He just kept pushing forward. "Where is the entrance?" Tom belted out, keeping a quick pace. Dan followed behind, continuing to look back at the strange door they couldn't get to. Frustrated and at his wit's end, Tom continued forward, scanning the hall ahead for its entrance. Another 10 minutes passed, and the hall stayed the same. Finally, the door was washed in the light of the headlamp, and relief came. They were both starting to feel as if this place wasn't going to let them leave. Walking back into the concrete locker room and passing the rusty remnants of whatever this place was or is, Dan sweeped his headlamp around the room, and they pushed on back into the original hallway they had entered in. They finished the hall and found themselves on the concrete steps just outside of the odd area and back into the tunnel itself. Descending the stairs and back up onto the tracks that ran through the dark tunnel, both disoriented from what they had just experienced, they realized just how quiet that place was. The silent now replaced with the constant sound of water dripping and the wind that seemed to carry voices with it, or in it. Tom glanced at his watch and realized hours had passed. Dan followed closely behind and felt a light vibration at his feet, starting low and rising. The two realized what it was: a train. Before they could utter a word, the tracks were shaking loudly, and a massive light pierced the darkness ahead. The train sounded its horns, and both friends quickly jumped to the side. "Quick!" Tom yelled. "The door!" He added, barely audible with the train quickly approaching. They ran over and found no door, no stairs, nothing but rough-cut stone of the tunnel and the puddles of disgusting dirty water. Both friends pushed themselves up against the wall of the tunnel. As the train screamed by, shooting sparks off the tracks, and its metal wheels loudly spinning on them, the train passed, and the rumble it made had soon followed with it. Soon the sound of the train was gone, and the tunnel's ambience of dripping water and whispers returned. "Fuck this," Tom said, standing there in the puddle. "Let's get out of here," he added. Dan pointed his light down the tunnel. "I thought we timed it right." Tom cut him off. "We did, but we were in that weird corridor for over 2 hours. The two walked up to the tracks and set off the way they had entered. Soon the entrance was visible, and they both picked up the pace, turning off their headlamps and running to the light. The sun was warm as it hit their faces. They made their way back to the parked Jeep. "Did we even make it to Central Shaft?" Dan asked Tom. "I don't think so," he replied, unsure of what had happened. "You want to try starting from the other end?" Dan asked. "No, I'm good, bro. That was really crazy. I didn't think we were going to get out of there." Tom decided in that moment to never go back into that tunnel again. Dan was lured by the strange discovery of the concrete hall and rooms. The strange door that couldn't be reached, with its glowing yellow pane. Dan made plans to return the following weekend and entered from the opposite side. Never to be heard from again. You could drive up to Central Shaft that connected to the tunnel. Several months after Dan's disappearance, Tom drove through the woods that covered the tunnel. He pulled up on the dirt road that bordered the Central Shaft building, getting out near the huge steel pipes that vented the tunnel. Birds chirping, and the sounds of wildlife all around. The familiar smell of diesel exhaust hung in the air, and he thought he heard voices. Or a voice. Was it his friend? Was that Dan? And he thought he heard the words, "Tom, help me." I hope you enjoyed today's True Tales of Terror, The Tunnel, our fourth in the True Tales of Terror series. Be safe out there. Take care.